Okay, I'd like to go ahead and call to order the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services for April 13th at 3:34 by way of roll call. I see that Senators Kieckepfer, Hardy, Spearman, and Harris are here with us today. Today, we're going to go ahead and hear one Senate concurrent resolution and 2 Assembly bills. We're going to start with Assembly Bill 16, then we'll do Senate Concurrent Resolution 5, and then we'll go back to Assembly Bill 35 in that order. With that, I'll go ahead and invite Mr. Wickman with the Department of Corrections to the virtual dais to present Assembly Bill 16.
Good afternoon, Chair, Committee. For the record, my name is Harold Wickham, and I will be presenting AB 16 on behalf of the Department of Corrections. This is an act relating to vital statistics, prohibiting the charging of fees for issuance of copies of certificates and records of birth to persons who are in prison and providing other matters properly relating thereto. So I really think this is an excellent opportunity for our agency to move forward with presenting and publishing certificates as needed. And I think it's an awesome bill. So pending your questions, I'm available.
Excellent bill presentation, Mr. Wickham. Did the committee members have any questions? No questions from the committee? All right, let's go ahead and open it up for public testimony. Is there, BPS, go ahead if there's anybody who would like to testify in support on Assembly Bill 16.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in support of Assembly Bill 16, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Will the caller with the last 3 digits of 725 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Good afternoon, Chair Ratty and committee members. This is Nick Shepak, N-I-C-K-S-H-E-P-A-C-K, Policy and Program Associate with the ACLU of Nevada. We want to thank the Nevada Department of Corrections and Deputy Director Wickham for that amazing presentation. We stand in strong support of AB 16. It should be the policy of the state to ensure that incarcerated populations have the tools they need to succeed upon release. Over 90% of those in the state that are currently incarcerated will get out of prison. It is one of the privileges of my life to work with formerly incarcerated individuals. I work closely with people who have spent 20, 30, or even 40 years incarcerated. To be released without necessary documents, such as a birth certificate, can lead to an untold number of issues. Obtaining a new birth certificate can be difficult, even for those of us who willingly subject ourselves to government bureaucracy regularly. Imagine if you have never used a computer with the internet and you now have to navigate this system. When someone is released from prison, they are forced to find housing, food, and employment. This is the focus, and a birth certificate is often needed to obtain these things. Every time we release someone unprepared to succeed, we put them, their families, and our communities in danger. AB 16 is a simple yet impactful piece of legislation that will reduce recidivism and increase success rates for Nevada's formerly incarcerated. We urge your support, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Will the next caller with the last 3 digits of 656 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Hi, Will Pregman with Battlelord Progress, W-I-L-L, P as in Peter, R-E-G-M-A-N. Speak in support of AB 16. I will keep it short and ditto the previous speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. Will the next caller with the last 3 digits of 318 also please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Good afternoon, Chair Ratty and members of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. This is Kendra Birchie, BERTSCHY, with the Washoe County Public Defender's Office. We would just echo the statements before us and put our support on the record for AB 16 because this is an easy way to provide our community members with a way to ensure that they have a chance to succeed in the future. So we appreciate this bill and thank you.
Will the next caller with the last three digits of 080 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Hi, Jim Hoffman, Hoffman, representing Nevada Attorneys for Criminal Justice. NACJ supports AB 16 for the reasons that have already been discussed. And I guess I would just mention the famous proverb here, for one of a nail, the horseshoe didn't stay on the horse. One of a horse, they lost the battle. For one of the battle, they lost the entire kingdom. Access to birth certificates is the nail. It's a really small investment, but it can have a really outsized impact on helping both incarcerated people and the community at large. And so we think that the committee should pass AB 16, and we're thankful for bringing it. Thank you.
If there are any additional callers who would like to testify in support of AB 16, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Will the caller with the last three digits of 499 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Good afternoon. My name is Jody Hocking, Jodihocking. I'm the founder of Return Strong Families United for Justice for the Incarcerated, and I'm here today in support of AB 16. As many of you know and have heard me testify, my husband's incarcerated at NDOC, but what you may not be aware of is that he actually was impacted by this exact issue. He was released, one of the people that was released after winning a lawsuit on AB 510, and sadly for a variety of reasons, mainly being institutionalized and having PTSD, led him to get into a fight that resulted in a violation and returned him to prison. Today, I want to share a personal story of what happened when he came home from prison and how not having a birth certificate in his hand impacted him, and what I believe really is part of the factor that caused him to return. He came home from prison with no identification, no birth certificate, no identity, and could not be found in vital statistics. We still don't really understand why or what that happened, because he went through the school system in Nevada. He'd been incarcerated in Nevada, but when we went to get a birth certificate, he was non-existent. We have been asking for 2 years at NDOC for help in finding his birth certificate and could not get any. The reality is, not having a birth certificate made it impossible for him to get health insurance, made it impossible for him to start getting a job. He was accepted into a training program in the trades union and ended up not being able to attend because of not having a birth certificate. That voucher for a free certificate did absolutely nothing in terms of helping him resolve an issue that he could have gotten resolved before he came home. We're in full support of this. People need to be able to prove their identity the minute they walk out. We expect them to find jobs and be ready to reintegrate into society, and you cannot do that if you do not have documentation of who you are. So I just want to say this, we have been very, very personally impacted by this, and the voucher was great, but that voucher didn't do anything, and it would have been identified sooner had we been providing birth certificates before they left the facility. So we are, as an organization and personally, in support of AB 16, and thank you for your time. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Will the
Callers,
next caller
perhaps-
with the last...
I was just going to say a gentle reminder that if you're testifying and you have the hearing on in the background, to turn the hearing off. It will make it easier for us to hear you.
Thank you, Chair. Will the next caller with the last three digits of 611 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services. This is John Piro, Johnpiro, from the Clark County Public Defender's Office, and we wanted to testify and register our support for this measure. It always baffles me a little bit that we can verify somebody's identity enough to lock them away for years of their life, but then not provide them with a document when they get out so that they can identify themselves and start to rehabilitate their lives. So this is a great measure, and we strongly urge the passage. Thank you.
Thank you, caller. If there are any additional callers who would like to testify in support of Assembly Bill 16, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no additional callers wishing to give testimony in support.
Thank you, BPS. Let's go ahead and move to testimony in opposition on AB 16.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in opposition to AB 16, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Once again, callers, if you would like to testify in opposition to AB 16, please press *9 now. Chair Ratty, at this time, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers wishing to give testimony in opposition.
You're still on mute, Chair.
Can anybody guess what we're going to do next? Let's do testimony in neutral on AB 16.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in a neutral position for AB 16, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Once again, if you would like to testify in a neutral position, please press *9 now. Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no callers wishing to give a neutral testimony.
All right, thank you. Committee, so we had a little bit of fun with it being a very short bill presentation, but it's 3 words. And those 3 words allow for these folks to get their birth certificate while they are still imprisoned. So a very straightforward bill. And so what I'd like to do is suggest that we just go ahead and work session it today. So I would be looking for a motion to do pass.
So moved, Chair Ratty.
Got a motion from Senator Harris, second from Senator Kieckhofer. Any discussion? I will just say that while it is a very simple bill and while it's a bill with only 3 words, I do think that it'll make a significant impact in terms of folks being able to get a head start into being successful as they leave. So thank you, Mr. Wickham, for bringing the bill. And with that, Secretary, would you please call the vote?
Senator Hardy,
Yes.
Senator Harris,
Yes.
Senator Kieckhofer,
Yes.
Senator Spearman,
Yes.
Chair Ratty.
Yes. With that, that completes our business on AB 16, and we are going to go ahead and move on to Senate Concurrent Resolution 5, and I would like to invite Vice Chair Spearman to the virtual dais.
Thank you, Chair Ratty and committee members. I am Pat Spearman. I represent Senate District 1, in Clark County, and I'm here today to present Senate Concurrent Resolution 5 for your consideration. Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible. These are the words of the great Maya Angelou. Prejudice has contributed to the creation of systemic racism and structures of racial discrimination that result in generational poverty and perpetuate debilitating economic, educational, health, and health challenges, which disproportionately affect people of color. Senate Concurrent Resolution 5 takes a step toward addressing this systemic racism and structures of racial discrimination and their disproportionate impact on people of color in the COVID-19 era. For these reasons and others, during the 32nd special session, the Nevada Legislature adopted Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, which declares that systemic racism and structures of racial discrimination constitute a public health crisis. Indeed, last week, the director of the CDC stated very clearly, racism is a public health crisis. We've talked about it a long time, but it's time now to act on solutions that are designed to deconstruct this poison in our society. Senate Concurrent Resolution 5 declares that all Nevada residents have equal consideration and opportunity under the law, policies, and practices of the state. Systemic racism and structures of racial discrimination constitute a public health crisis magnified by the disproportionate high impact of COVID-19 in communities of color. Nevada supports local, state, regional, and federal initiatives to understand, address, and dismantle systemic racism and its impact on the delivery of human, social, and economic development and public safety. Federal funding should be, I didn't make a mistake, federal funding should be distributed equitably based on the portion of members of BIPOC communities to address issues that disproportionately affect those communities in direct proportion to their disadvantage by individual racial category. I've asked some professionals to come along with me today who have worked in various community projects. I have Mr. Sean Rochester, who has experience working in corporate America, and he is also the author of The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America, and I'm sure you all have heard me mention him several times. Cara Freeman, professional dietitian. Elisa Howard, doing community health care for the last 9 years. Tina Deutsch, Office of Minority Health and Equity. Reverend Dr. Karen Anderson, senior pastor of First AME Church in Las Vegas. And community leader, we've got also Ms. Yendra Dixon, who is a community and organizing activist in our community. She is the principal for Black Box Consulting. I'm going to turn now to Mr. Rochester and ask if he will start us off, if that's okay with you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Senator Spearman and Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the economic costs of discrimination against Black people. As Senator Spearman stated, I wrote a book, amongst other things, but called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I talk about the economic cost of discrimination. Normally, when people talk about discrimination, they tend to focus on the injustice or the immorality associated with that. I look at what is the economic cost of discrimination, and more importantly, what does research from the finest institutions in the country say that that cost is. It examines the cost, in the modern day, present context. It does a look back from the time of slavery up until now. It lays out where we are as a nation, with Black people owning about 2% of US wealth, and lays out an economic case called PhD for how we can create the millions of jobs and businesses and provide capital that's missing in the Black community, and organize that in ways that leads to better health and educational outcome. And one of the areas I just want to talk about a little bit is housing, right? Because it's 64% of the wealth profile associated with the typical Black family, and obviously wealth affects educational outcomes, it affects health outcomes, it affects, trauma, a whole host of other issues that exacerbates. What is behind this cost of discrimination, this notion of the black tax? It emanates from conscious and unconscious bias from institutions, from individuals, from organizations, and from corporations. So one of the most important questions to ask first is, what are the levels of bias, anti-Black bias, that exist in the country today? If we look at work that's been done by Stanford University in Michigan and the University of Chicago, along with the Associated Press, they examined the level of anti-Black bias across the American electorate back in 2012. They found bias levels, conscious, explicit, people know exactly what they're doing, levels of about 51%, which is surprisingly high. In terms of unconscious levels or implicit bias, they found that the levels were about 56%, almost 6 in 10. If you look at some of the work that Harvard has done with their implicit association test, it's called an IAT test. It's online at their site. Millions and millions of Americans have taken this test. It's an extraordinarily clever way of teasing out unconscious bias. Citigroup reports that the millions of Americans who've taken that test have 75% of what they call automatic white preference, which is a fancy way of saying anti-Black bias. If you look at the subgroup within that larger group, that's just white Americans, it's 85% are the levels of automatic white preference or anti-Black bias. Researchers from Harvard say that the presence of automatic white preference is predictive of discriminatory behavior, and that is an empirical truth, which means that it is demonstrable, in the data. The issue becomes, how does that manifest itself in the marketplace, and to what extent does it have, a cash flow or wealth impact? If we take a look at the housing space, which is the massive generator of wealth for Americans in general, and Black people in particular, it starts off rather innocuous. You will be told about 20% less homes. You will be shown about 20% less homes. And then it starts to get more material. When you apply for mortgages, you'll be treated as if your credit is 71 points lower, which is quite substantial. When you are applying, you're 60% more likely to be denied. With the same credit profile as your white peer, you're 3 times more likely to receive an interest rate that's a higher interest rate versus your credit worthiness. It's 150 basis point higher. You're typically more likely to receive higher closing costs. And if you live in a predominantly Black community, which most Black people do, the appreciation of your equity is substantially lower, leading into 18% less in terms of homeowner appreciation. So your appreciation on the home is higher. Your cost to carry it through interest rates is also much higher. If you look at that over a 30-year period for a homeowner that bought a house that was about $450,000, the incremental costs associated with this idea of you being Black would be about $345,000. That's wealth that's not available for you to cover costs today, or for you to leave for intergenerational transfers. And then when you're selling it, you have an appraisal gap, which is if typically on average, because of conscious and unconscious bias, if appraisers are aware that the home is owned by a Black person, whether it's art, photos, pictures, or your mere presence, you're likely to receive a much lower appraisal on your home. These are massive, significant material economic costs. It even shows up in the labor market. If you look at the same resumes that are sent out to individuals, if you have a white sounding name, which is an indication that you're likely to be a white candidate, you're going to get 50% higher callbacks versus the same resume with a Black sounding name. As you increase the quality of the resume, if it has a white sounding name, the interest goes up substantially by 30%, which is obviously makes sense. If it's a Black sounding name, it doesn't change at all, statistically indifferent. You actually need about 8 years of incremental work experience to overcome just the impact, of a name. Turns out that if you're a white felon with that resume, you'll have a higher callback ratio than a Black college grad. So this shows up in significant ways, and even shows up at ultra high-end careers like lawyers and the like. The work product of legal memos from Black lawyers is evaluated substantially different. 100% more errors are found. The quality of the work is deemed as significantly lower, and their projections to be a good partner within the firm is compromised because of that. All things being equal, just the perception of who they believe, wrote the work. Even when it comes to capital raising for businesses, Black business owners pay 100% more, 100 basis point higher for their business loans. And this is at all levels. If you're a Black business owner with superior credit, you pay higher interest rate than your white peer with the same superior credit. If you have moderate credit, you pay this more than your white peer with moderate credit. If you have poor credit, you pay more than your white peer with the same kind of poor credit profile. The problem here is that this bias shows up both in a conscious and an unconscious way. And it has an economic and discriminatory, impact. These are things that are just happening today. The impact of the difference in the value of real estate across the Black, population is about $150 billion lower than it otherwise should be associated with these, perceptions that we're talking about here. If you juxtapose that with some of the historical aspects, and there are too many things to mention, but I'll just touch on a few of them. If you look at the resources distributed through the New Deal and the GI Bill, less than 2% of that went to Black people. If you go as far back as the Homestead Act, which distributed 246 million acres to give Americans a great start in life. About 99.7% of that went to white Americans. Almost none of it went to any Black Americans. You have the extraordinary draconian costs of the Jim Crow period, where almost 100% tax was placed on the labor of people engaged in those processes. If you look at the FHA redlining, I won't go into that. I know you guys are very familiar with that, but what we can say in a concrete way is that between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the country went to Black Americans, almost a complete and total shutout of one of the greatest wealth building processes that the world has ever seen. Even in Black urban communities in the 60s, goods and services are 3 times higher than they were outside of those communities. Federal Trade Commission did a study on that in 1968. And then if you look at the impact of the maldistribution and human capital development in the separate but equal system that lasted for almost about 90 years in the country, you're talking about trillions of dollars of impact for the underdevelopment of millions of Black children within the educational system. The impact of all of that from a historical perspective and what is still happening now has led to Black Americans owning about 2% of U.S. wealth, right? This is a massive, despite being, about 13% of the population. The difference in wealth between the mean average white family and mean average Black family is $841,000. If you apply that across 17 million Black families, it's about a $14 trillion gap in terms of wealth, right? That's the literal quantification of the wealth gap, right, between Black and white families. And wealth, as you know, it has a massive determinative impact on health outcomes, on educational outcomes, on mental health outcomes, and exacerbates a whole host of other issues. So it's really critical that people understand not only how things came to be, but where things are now, and that you really need defined, focused, specific, and targeted programs to be able to maximize the impact on this dramatically affected, population. So anti-Black bias is far higher than we all, would certainly want, and many people realize. The impact, both present and past, has been draconian. And then the other thing is to understand is that there's also been a massive impact on the country itself. McKinsey has done, independent studies that says if we close the wealth gap, after a decade, it would generate about $1.5 trillion of incremental resources in terms of GDP to the nation. And if Black people had been included in the innovation process that occurred between 1870 and 1950, it would have added about $2 trillion worth of GDP to
Thank you, Mr. Rochester.
I'll pause there.
Yeah, Mr. Rochester. So, Madam Chair, what I had asked him to do was just lay the foundation as to why some of these disparities exist. And what I'd like to do now is go to Carl Freeman. She is a dietitian, and ask her to speak to nutrition as it relates to health.
Good afternoon, Chair Ratty and committee members. For the record, my name is Dr. Carol Freeman. and I am speaking as a state policy representative and president-elect for the Nevada Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. As Senator Spearman has said, I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. I'd like to address the health disparities found in the African American population. Nutrition is an important factor in many health-related diseases. Nationwide, 70% of Americans are either overweight or obese. A person who's overweight has a body mass index, which is a ratio between height and weight, over 25, and obesity is measured at 30 or higher. Depending on which source you look at, between 13 to 14.6% of the U.S. population are classified as African American or Black. Of that group, 39% of men and 56% of women aged 20 or older are considered obese. The percentage of obesity among children and adolescents 6 to 11 years of age is almost 20%. Heart disease is one of the leading causes of death, followed by cancer in this community. High blood pressure is a contributing factor to heart disease, and 40% of non-Hispanic.
Ms. Freeman?
Yes.
I apologize for introducing you, but I've heard from our secretaries that they're having a hard time hearing you loud enough to be able to get the record.
Okay.
And so I don't know if you can get a little closer to the mic or try to speak up just a little bit louder.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. I'll start again with heart disease is one of the leading causes of death, followed by cancer in this community. High blood pressure is a contributing factor to heart disease, and 40% of non-Hispanic African American men and women have high blood pressure. While genetics may be a factor, poor nutrition habits are key to the increased risk of high blood pressure, obesity, and heart disease. In addition, 80% of African Americans are more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes and are 2.5 times more likely to begin treatment of end-stage renal disease. There's a lot more data, but I think these figures give you an idea of the need for improvement of health and nutrition in this community. Access to healthy foods is of utmost importance to everyone, but healthy foods are not always available to the African American and Black community. Poverty, lack of education, and housing could be contributing factors. We see food deserts where healthy food is not available, especially fresh fruit and vegetables. However, convenience stores selling junk food are abundant in these areas. Without nutrition and public health education, bad nutrition habits will continue, making the public health crisis in Nevada even more of an issue than it already is. SB 297, which has passed the Senate Government Affairs Committee, will address part of the problem by requiring that a master plan include an urban agriculture element that provides vacant and blighted lands for community gardens and urban farms. This is exciting, and that we know that people, and especially children, will eat the foods that they grow. So hopefully these gardens will provide much needed produce to a community that desperately needs it. Nutrition education will certainly be a factor in mitigating public health issues in Nevada. Thank you for your attention today. I'm sorry, I should have used my classroom voice when I started, I didn't.
You did just fine, Ms. Freeman, and it looked like you have perhaps had written your comments out. And so if you could email them to us just to make sure that we do get, if there's any gaps, that we get them in the record, that would be great.
I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a couple more. Miss Elisa Howard, who is a community health worker, and Tina Dorch, and everybody knows we're trying to keep our comments under 5 so that we can get into the questions and not prolong the time so you don't have time for the other bill. So, Ms. Howard.
Good day, all. My name is Elisa Howard, for the record. I am the owner of Minority Health Consultants, a woman-owned public health consulting firm, and I'm also a college instructor who teaches community health work. In both of my professions, I work towards dismantling racism in public health through education, equity initiatives, and advocacy. It greatly saddens me that we still have to have these conversations about racism in 2021. Racism is a social construct, an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a society. This idea has been woven into the fabric of this country and systematically affects every area of society, from education to our criminal systems, economics, and of course our healthcare system. We've seen racism in public health at play in many instances historically, such as the United States syphilis experiment, the stealing of Henrietta Lacks DNA, but our most recent account is how marginalized BIPOC and minority communities and businesses have not been treated equitably during this COVID pandemic. These communities have been impacted disproportionately, not just now, but for the last 400 years. In my observation throughout my decade-long public health profession, working at the state level, local government, and community level, I have seen that this is due to marginalized communities often being thought about last and not being cared for as a whole of the community, but a separate section when it comes to funding for businesses, health, education, treatment, and access to healthcare. Structural inequities have been found to have a direct correlation to structural racism. Across the country, BIPOC communities are suffering from insufficient access to jobs, adequate transit, safe and affordable housing, you name it, and we are on there. As business owners, we are also on there. Opportunities during this pandemic and before to build our businesses have not. As I read, I just wanted to tie back to our topic, which is racism is a public health crisis that we are asking you to recognize. Today would be a great day to dust off all of the racial injustice, anti-racism, and equity statements that are being penned and begin the work that our state has pledged to do in the name of racial allyship. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ms. George?
Good afternoon. My name is Tina Dortch, D-O-R-T-C-H. Since 2018, I have managed the Office of Minority Health and Equity, to be referred to interchangeably as NOMI or the office going forward. Thank you to members of the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. I will use my time to address how the concept of proportional allocation framed within Senate Concurrent Resolution 5 reflects in Senate Bills 302, Senate Bill 341, and the role of the office. Before illustrating these points, please allow me to outline the circumstances that have brought us to this opportunity. When the late Assemblyman Tyrone Thompson envisioned the office being reestablished, he sponsored the 2017 Assembly Bill number 141. His vision was reflected in the office's new name, the Office of Minority Health and Equity. Today, the approach to achieve its mission has been redirected, predicated on its new name. The office's charge prioritizes activities that result in the institutionalization of equitable, health-determining efforts, be they outreach/awareness oriented, regulatory, policy, or programmatic in nature. Should Senate Bills 302, 341, and today's concurrent resolution pass, the embedding of equity enhancing protocols would take place from state legislative processes to state funding decisions to agency level administration. And the office's internal capacity would be enhanced and its ability to support its target populations increased. Senate Bill 302 addresses implicit bias, fosters allyship, and serves to embed health-related equity. For example, it describes requiring public employers to provide racial equity training to each of its officers and employees, beyond those specifically identified as health providers. However, it is a provision of Senate Bill 302 that allows for proportional allocation that I'd like to point out, and that is the creation of a new racial equity worksheet. Section 8 of this particular bill describes requiring the Legislative Council to work in consultation with NOMI's advisory committee in developing a racial equity worksheet to be used during the bill draft resolution process. NOMI's advisory committee will also analyze completed equity worksheets to then shape policy recommendations, identify discriminatory structural barriers, and establish a system of measurement to track improvements. It is at this point that NOMI, through its advisory committee, would also make recommendations that reflect proportional allocations. Senate Bill 341 gives the office the ability to strategically identify, form, and support joint partnerships operating at the community level to address disproportionate impacts of COVID and other chronic conditions. However, the provision of Senate Bill 341 that allows for proportional allocation is the creation and use of a new minority health equity account. Specifically, per its Section 8, the money in the account must be expended to develop and carry out programs and activities of the office, and also would allow the manager, within limits of available funds, to award and grant with reviews by its advisory committee. A minority health equity would allow the office to foster sub-awarded partnerships with community groups whose missions amplify those of NOMI's. An equity account under the administrative control of NOMI could address resource gaps experienced by smaller or less grant-savvy entities, providing nonetheless impactful support, and it would also provide capacity building, and this is done because of a distributed proportional allocation. In closing, proportionate allocations, as suggested by this Senate concurrent resolution, will circumvent the effects of the pandemic, creating additional chronic conditions across not only health indicators, but also other determining factors related to health. And furthermore, the resolution's commitment to incorporate subjects of systemic racism and structures of racial discrimination into the regular business of the Nevada Legislature will serve to complement and amplify actions of the Department of Health and Human Services in response to the governor's proclamation naming racism a public health crisis. Put quite plainly, conducting allocations proportionate to burdens experienced by BIPOC communities addresses disparities at impactful levels. And adopting this concurrent resolution is in keeping with the intent of Assemblyman Thompson's Assembly Bill 141. This concludes my remarks, and thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one more, and that's Pastor Karen Anderson. She worked diligently with the community in Ferguson, Missouri after the murder of Michael Brown. And I'd like for her to address why this is important from a pastoral standpoint. Pastor Anderson.
Thank you, Senator Spearman and Madam Chair. I am the Reverend Dr. Karen Anderson, the senior pastor of First AME Church in North Las Vegas, also known as Fame Community Church. We have listened attentively to the way that poverty and racism have had a disparate effect on communities of color. This issue of structural racism has been shown to be exacerbated during COVID-19. As the pastor of a historically Black church, the only independent denomination in our nation, started by people of African descent as a protest against discriminatory worship and social justice practices, it has been imperative for us to work towards equity in our society. We are a denomination whose focus has always been on meeting the spiritual, emotional, and physical needs of all people. Faith has played a critical and central role in the life of the BIPOC community. We are often the place where people come when they have a need that is not being addressed by our government. We are the stopgap. Pastors are the ones who are often the first point of contact in a community. We are often the ones who have to make up the difference when there is a financial need. We are there for emotional and physical needs. We are there when there's a housing need. So we have seen what has happened in COVID-19 and the disparate distribution of wealth. I'm reminded of the book of Acts, in which the 4th chapter, where they talked about how the community came together and there was no needy among them. I believe that this is the call of a faith community and a nation built on faith, that we are charged to ensure that there are no needy among us, that we do whatever we can to meet the needs of the marginalized, to bring them back into the center. I'm also reminded of the words of Jeremiah, where he parodied religious and political leaders when he talked about the fact that people are always calling for peace. We think of peace as the absence of conflict. Peace in the Hebrew Bible means the absence of justice. We will never have peace in our nation until we have justice. We must remember that justice should not be based on race, class, ethnicity, gender-loving preference, or religious affiliation. We are all created equal in the eyes of God, and we must be those who seek to ensure that every member of our community has access to what they need. As a pastor in this COVID, I have sat with families who have struggled because of unemployment. As we often say in our minority communities, we are often the last hired and the first fired. We have noticed the lack of childcare, food insecurity, inability to access needed services. We've counseled families who are struggling with emotional trauma from the loss of loved ones for whom they could not even afford the burial cost. We are watching as students are being adversely affected. Just last week, I had a parent call who was extremely distressed because her 15-year-old is talking about suicide because she's not been able to be in school and she has watched her grades drop in this pandemic. It is imperative upon us to begin to build a community in which every human being's life has value, where there is respect and dignity for each one of us. And that does mean that we must begin to ensure that there is equitable distribution of wealth and opportunities for us to move forward. That is all I need to say, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Pastor. And Chair Ratty, that ends the presenters that I have. I have on the phone, on the Zoom, also Mr. Dennis Creary, who is the president of Blacks on Wall Street, and so he can address any substantive questions or subsequent questions that may come up about this. So thank you all for listening to this. And I know it's kind of long, but I thank you for listening to this. We wanted to lay the foundation and show how healthcare, disparate healthcare, distribution of monies, et cetera, to our communities, how that indeed affects the community all the way around. So with that, Madam Chair, we will stand for questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair Spearman. First of all, just let me express my gratitude to Mr. Rochester, Ms. Freeman, Ms. Howard, Pastor Anderson, Ms. Dortch, and yourself for pulling together the compelling presentation. I actually didn't think that it was extraordinarily long at all. I felt like you did an amazing job of condensing, I think what one of you said was 400 years of history into a relatively brief and to the point presentation. So thank you for that. I will open it up to the committee for specific questions or comments. Seeing none, I guess my question would be, acknowledging that there is this range of 400 years of history, 200 years of history, 100 years of history, and that in each phase of that history, the inequity was sort of baked into our institutions and into our society, and then unfortunately had an exponential impact as time passed, and recognizing that in many ways we've made progress, but in other ways, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown a light on many of the ways we have not made progress. It looks like you've hung your hat in terms of a policy recommendation for moving forward on proportionate allocation of resources. And that's one policy strategy. I guess with having the opportunity to have this expert panel with us today, are there other policy recommendations that you would want to make sure that this committee or the legislature as a whole are aware of that can specifically address the wealth inequities that lead to the health inequities? And I know we have Mr. Creary and we have Mr. Rochester here that seem like they have a pretty deep level of expertise in that particular topic, and just would want to see if there's anything else that they would want to put on our radar.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to ask Mr. Rochester to answer first, but I'd also like Mr. Creary to answer as president of Blacks on Wall Street.
Right.
Madam Chair, thank you for the question. That's an enormous question. So what I want to do is just talk first about frameworks by which we could judge or measure the efficacy and impact of policies, plans, and that may ultimately be put in place. So one of the things that I talked about and that the book is really meant to do is to be the strongest possible case for like commercializing Black enterprise, so we can have, impacts that address three major gaps, right? So as you are aware of, there's a massive gap when it comes to jobs, right? In and across the Black community. It was, over 6 million previously prior to COVID, the COVID pandemic. That's obviously been exacerbated. There's a massive gap in businesses. There's 2.56 million Black businesses. Only 4% of those are large enough to have any employees, and only 2% of that 4% do over, kind of 10 million a year. But that 4% generates about 70% of the revenue, about $100 billion a year, employs about 1 million people. It's only about 110,000 businesses that generate all of that, and we're missing 1.4 million of those. So there's an enormous missing kind of business infrastructure. And then I talked about the wealth gap. So the policies and plans need to have a direct stimulative impact on job creation, on business formation and expansion, and on capital availability and affordability within the Black community. the thriving communities and enclaves and ecosystems that we all want, right, for ourselves and others cannot be built, right, in an infrastructure that has a gap in jobs, business, right, and capital. So having that as a framework, and I call that framework PhD, right, which is purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital, right, in the Black community. It needs to have that direct, stimulative, impact. The second thing that I would say, and I'm just talking about frameworks and overarching things right now. We can go into specificity at any point that you guys will like if we have some more time. But we need to kind of have an ecosystem approach as we look at creating, affecting communities, right, that are dealing with, economic deprivation. You have, terrific things in place like opportunity zones would have an incentive to bring in capital, but it's not designed to follow this PhD format, right? So it imports talent. It doesn't upskill talent within the community, right? And as companies are formed, as real estate is developed, it's not utilizing the products and services of the businesses within that community. It's not using the local content, right, that's associated with it. So you can have $1 billion project that happens in an economically deprived community and have really little or marginal impact on the people that are living there, right? So what are the investments that are made in upskilling the talent? How are we working with private enterprise for them to clearly articulate the skill sets that they need within these areas? How do we bring in, nonprofits to help with that upskilling, process? Bring in, the banks who can help provide some capital, and then have resources allocated, right, from the public sector to be able to kind of turbocharge the whole thing, right? So you can have an ecosystem approach and a coordination amongst very different parties that have a similar, intention. We tend to see point solutions that aren't leveraging the combined impact of the various solutions that are out there. So it needs to be directly stimulative to jobs, business, and capital within the Black community in particular. A lot of these communities are, they define them as kind of low income communities. The fundamental issue behind why they're low income is because there's low skill and there's low resources there. And we need to make sure that we work on providing the resources to upskill and to bring in the jobs that are family sustaining, right? Not these kind of minimal type jobs. So we have the ecosystem approach. And then there's many other things that we can talk about. I don't want to hog the time, but, we have to deal with the unbanked. We have to deal with our folks having to deal with check cashing places, which can cost over $40,000 of incremental fees over a lifetime. That's massive levels of economic leakage, upskilling, education. And of course, the healthcare infrastructure that is there is vitally critical. We have the worst health, we have the worst access to healthcare, and we have the worst treatment while we are dealing with healthcare, professionals. So I'll kind of pause there and shift things to Mr. Creary.
Please go ahead, Mr. Curry. I think we are unable to hear you, sir. Is there a microphone issue? It looks like you're unmuted, but it might be a connection to your headphones. Why don't we go to Ms. Dixon, and then BPS, perhaps we can get a phone line for Mr. Curry to call in on?
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Vice Chair Spearman, and committee members. Thank you so much. My name is Deandra Dixon. I'm the managing partner for Black Box Consulting Group. I also run a political organization called Empower 360 that helps to turn out Black voters in Nevada. The question was, what types of economic policies can we put in place today that will help us lead to the dismantling of systemic racism? So I think that in Tina's presentation, she gave a lot of very specific things that are necessary for policymaking. Looking at the racial equity worksheet, centering racial equity in how we design policy, measuring the outcomes and evaluating our policy based on those things. That's absolutely imperative across all aspects of our government. Specifically related to economics, there are things in the short term, right, that we could affect and make significant change. Those things would be in the areas of workforce equity. So having our state government located in Carson City, which doesn't have a diverse population of people, limits the number of applicants who want to or can live in Carson City in order to work with the government. And so when we start to look at the state as a whole, it's important that we, as the government of the state, not we, you, as the government of the state, are looking at issues like workforce equity so that we can bring people of color into the middle class. I'm sure Mr. Rochester has some very direct data, and I can provide some as well, that talks about how significantly good government paying jobs with benefits can help to elevate people into the middle class immediately. And that's something that we can work on, we can measure, and we can look at it from a depth and breadth perspective. So not just across all of the agencies at low levels, but also up into decision-making and policy-making roles as well. Significant change. Another very important piece would be contracting equity. How many people do we do business with in the government, and which of those businesses are run by people of color? Oftentimes we have the pushback that, oh, I was looking for this, concrete provider or some kind of construction company in order to provide the services. But because of barriers to entry and structural racism, systemic racism, those businesses have not been able to prosper. And so 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when some of the original construction companies we are using were able to be formed, people of color were left out of that process of creating those companies. They took a lot of investment, they needed bank loans. And so when you're comparing a 40-year-old construction company to a 2-year-old construction company, and the 2-year-old construction company may be owned by a person of color, you will look at the history of the 40-year-old company and weigh that in a different way, and therefore typically choose a more experienced contractor. And so that is what puts us at odds, right? That is where the equity comes in. It's that because the opportunities have not been fair across the board for a length of time, there's always going to be a disadvantage. And that's why we need to look at it from an equitable perspective. We can also look at, in contracting equity, the types of businesses that are run by people of color, and to focus our efforts specifically on choosing companies that come out of those types of industries. And those industries have lower barriers of entry. They're not construction companies that require $1 million to buy equipment and hundreds of people to hire. Those are smaller businesses. They might be more service oriented. And so we need to look at those types of things. I think the final piece is really to look at it from the standpoint of who the people in our government are interacting with. And so when you look at every system, the largest consumers of government services are people of color. And therefore, people of color and the businesses that they own and the folks that they're interacting with should also be people of color. And so we can make an intentional, deliberate action to ensure that we are providing that type of equity very simply, specifically in policy. And those would be huge economic drivers today.
Thank you. Checking in with Mr. Creary, have we connected you? Mr. Creary, can you hear me?
Chair, it sounds like BPS is still working on it with Mr. Creary.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if we can, I'd like to go to, because I think what Ms. Dixon said really parallels what Pastor Anderson said. And in some communities, the faith community.
Can you hear me?
Sorry. Yes, so Vice Chair Spearman, why don't we let Mr. Creary, when we got him, and then I'll come back to you.
Yes, ma'am.
So terribly sorry about that. And I should know better. I'm in IT, but that didn't work out well. Definitely an honor, Madam Chairman, to have the ability to address this esteemed group. As my learned friend Sean Rochester pointed out, from a very historic nature, the systemic pressures that our communities have been under globally for 400 years and beyond. There has to be something that various communities could and should do to address these disparities. Yeah. In 1948, there was a bill and an act passed in the UK, where I'm from, that stated, regardless of an individual's station in life, their most precious gift was their health. And that spawned the national health system, the NHS system. A system as such does not exist here in the States, where if an individual is poor or destitute, they become even that much more if they are ill. And that affects everyone of every ilk. You could be the wealthiest individual in the US or the poorest individual in the US. If you don't have your health, you can't function in your particular station in life. In 1919, at the onset of the Spanish flu, frontline workers were disproportionately affected and unrecorded, as many were Black and brown individuals. Fast forward 100 years later to this particular pandemic, we haven't learned anything from that history. And our frontline workers are still Black and brown and disproportionately affected. So I wanted to address your question that you had asked, if there are any other measures that could be made to address this disproportionate wealth, which has been systemic in Black and brown communities. And I would say, as was done by Winston Churchill in 1948 in the UK, that health is the first and foremost manner. And if you are disproportionately affected, you should be compensated at a disproportionate level as well. So, I just wanted to lend my support to what our learned friend, Senator Spearman, and team are trying to accomplish by making sure that these frontline workers and individuals who who have been and will be affected as COVID-19 continues its scourge in the US, that level of disproportionate access to healthcare be compensated by a disproportionate measure of funds going to that particular community. And I would also, Senator Spearman also reminded me, there was one other individual that we were trying to get to attend, and that's Dr. Randall Maxey, the world-renowned nephrologist, who is the chairman and CEO of Black Health in the US. He has been running a every Sunday global program talking about COVID's effects in Black communities across the globe. He was supposed to be on this call today, but he was, as his duty called him, he was called into to surgery about half an hour before the call. So he just wanted me to state on his behalf his support for this measure as well.
Thank you, Mr. Curry. I'm glad we were able to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Well, Madam Chair, I'd like to, Pastor Anderson said something that I know you've heard me say. We worked a couple of years ago trying to make sure that there were more minority providers credentialed and paneled, especially in places where you're talking about mental and emotional health. And I think that I think that's one of the things that we've not done well, but I'd like for Pastor Anderson to speak to the many hats that pastors wear when it comes to health and people coming and asking us all kinds of things, whether we have training in that or not. Pastor Anderson?
Thank you, Senator. I think one of the keys is that it would be very important to understand that partnering with the faith community can help a lot as we begin to move into neighborhoods. We have quite a bit of access to those in the community. We are the first line where we hear often what they're going through. We do know that there is a huge need for mental health services and for emotional health services during this time. So I think that it is important to really access and tap into the faith community who has a desire to see our community move forward. And I had a thought, which is, I am not a financial or business expert. I am a faith person. But I do pay attention to what happens around the country. And another way to help even this gap as we talk about policies. In St. Louis, one of the programs that they instituted was in communities of color, and particularly in the educational system. As children came into kindergarten, they were started a bank account, simply $50. Because one of the things we understand is we have not been taught how to manage money or been given money. The money grows over time so that as they prepare to go into whether it's college or into junior college, they begin to have something to fall back on. So policy can also be that we invest in our children, not just in their education, but also in financially helping them to be able to move out of this state of poverty that they currently exist in. There are programs where you can partner with banks to do financial literacy with children as young as kindergarten and first grade. Sometimes we wait to high school, and we have to remember that by the time we get to high school, we've lost so many of our children. But there are ways that as these funds come in, that we can funnel them directly to those who need them. But I do believe that the faith community can be a strong help. We are seeing a rise in mental health and depression, and for them to come to us. I don't have all of the information for what's available, but we know that we need more mental health services in school. As these children go back to school, they are going to need more counseling services, not just for the students, but also for teachers who have been directly impacted by trying to learn to do distance learning, spending on a dime to create educational programs that keep kids interested. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but one can be that we invest in our education, making sure we have the resources available on the ground, but also that you can partner with church communities. We offer space to build up, whether it's a counseling center or something like that, that can be directly in the neighborhood, because I think you heard earlier that transit is also an issue for many people living in our communities. They may be able to get next door to the church, but they may not be able to travel across town to get the services that they need.
Thank you, Pastor. I think sometimes it's also good to pause and celebrate a few successes. And so there's a few things that I've heard on the presentation today that I'd like to do a shout out. And one would be a shout out to Senator Neal, who has developed a wonderful program called Nevada Grow that really speaks to, I think, some of the things that Mr. Rochester was talking about in terms of investing in communities and building that ecosystem, that support system. So I want to give a shout out there. The good news is, Pastor Anderson, we do have that program where we put the $50 in the kindergartner's account. Perhaps the bad news is, I don't know that everybody really understands it, or we're connecting it, or we're building off it the next step. And so maybe there's a learning there that rather than building 50 new programs, we need to do a better inventory of the programs that we have already on the books and make sure that we're connecting those programs to communities of color and using wonderful spokesfolks. I think I just might have made up a word. Folks who are spokespeople to connect communities to programs that already exist, infrastructure that's already there, but may not be maximized. And then just a shout out to a Northern Nevada friend who put a lot of work into creating programs where there's financial coaching that happened at the church after the sermon, where folks worked on financial literacy with people they trusted and built built the tools to build assets and wealth right there in the pews of the church. So it was a pretty cool program. It was very powerful. So there are some wonderful things happening. I think it's how we connect the dots in many cases. With that, I'll just see if the committee has any additional questions or comments. Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am thrilled to hear where this is going and where some people have been. I recognize that in this pandemic, we've had challenges with getting the vaccines, and I think it's critical that we enlist the faith-based organizations we used to call churches in making sure that we get those people who are at risk, who are the frontliners, who have diseases, their vaccines, and get them by people who look like them, who are trusted by them. And I think it's just critical that we put the juxtaposition of the vaccines and the people who know the community and live in the community. I think that's a critical thing, and I don't know that we've heard as much about that, but I think the vaccine illustrates that we haven't really taken advantage of the people in the neighborhood. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Senator Harris, Senator Kieckhofer. Okay. So we'll go ahead and open the lines for public testimony. So if BPS, if you could give me a hand with opening the lines for support of SCR 5.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in support of SCR 5, please press star 9 now to enter the queue. Will the caller with the last 3 digits of 122 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Good afternoon, Chair Ratty, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Katie Ryan, K-A-T-I-E-R-Y-A-N, and I am the System Director of Nevada Government Relations for Dignity Health St. Rose Dominican, and I'm also a member of the Nevada Minority Health and Equity Coalition. I'm here testifying in support today for SCR 5. Health inequities and systematic racism have indeed caused a public health crisis. St. Rose is acting to address systematic inequities experienced by BIPOC and other underserved communities, and reversing the effects of systematic racism requires a long-term commitment. Our first steps include expanding access to care in underserved communities, improving how we track outcomes by race, expanding implicit and unconscious bias training, growing programs that impact the social causes of poor health, and further diversifying our leadership, workforce, and suppliers. One example of that is our 10-year partnership with Morehouse College of Medicine to develop and train more Black physicians. St. Rose also pays particularly close attention to the social determinants of health, as oftentimes the social causes of poor health need to be dealt with the same velocity as an acute medical condition. Some of these issues include housing, food insecurity, violence prevention, and access to culturally competent care, all of which you've heard a lot about today. Again, thanks to Senator Spearman for moving this concurrent resolution forward, and we vow to be a partner in the fight to make sure healthcare is equitable for all. Thank you, and I'm available for any questions.
Will the next caller with the last 3 digits of 069 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Hello, Chair Ratty, Vice Chair Spearman, and committee members. My name is Andre Wade, A-N-D-R-E-W-A-D-E, and I am the State Director for Civil State Equality and LGBTQ Civil Rights Organization, and a member of the Advisory Committee for the Nevada Office of Minority Health and Equity. And we are in full support of SCR 5. Civil State Equality takes an intersectional approach to the work we do, and are concerned about the compounding impacts of racism as a public health issue when one takes into consideration one's sexual orientation and gender identity, and the negative health outcomes related to Black, Indigenous, and people of color who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. We urge you to pass SCR 5 to improve the health and well-being of Nevadans. BIPOC communities tend to be at the bottom of positive health outcome measures, and when you take into consideration LGBTQ identity, it's doubly so. So thank you for your time and consideration. That ends my testimony.
Will the next caller with the last 3 digits of 383 please press *6 to try to unmute yourself? Thank you,
Hello.
caller. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record, and you may begin.
Hello, my name is Alyssa Lacap, ALYSSALACAP, and I'm in support of SCR 5. I am a student at UNLV as well as a person of color. I am also an intern for the American Heart Association, and this is the kind of work and policies that we would like to see more often, as we know that racism has a huge effect on public health. I have seen many of my friends who are people of color as well, having struggled this past year due to COVID-19, and I have seen many lives lost. I greatly urge for all of your support on this bill as well. Thank you.
If there are any additional callers who would like to testify in support of SCR 5, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no additional callers wishing to give testimony in support.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to testimony in opposition.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in opposition to SCR 5, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Once again, callers, if you would like to testify in opposition to SCR 5, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers wishing to give testimony in opposition.
And how about testimony in neutral?
Certainly, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in a neutral position for SCR 5, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Once again, callers, if you would like to testify in a neutral position for SCR 5, please press *9 now. Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no callers wishing to give a neutral testimony.
All right, thank you. Any additional comments to close out the presentation, Senator?
Yes, ma'am. One of the things that I know we need quick, fast, and in a hurry, and that is additional help in mental and emotional health arena. Pastor Anderson, are you still on?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Okay. Can you just speak to some of the things that you all did in the community after in Ferguson after Michael Brown's murder?
Yes, I can. You're correct. We do need a lot of mental and emotional health. We have to remember that many people who live in BIPOC communities live in what we would consider to be toxic stress environments, whether it's due to the lack of food, the safety, whether it is health related, and even just waking up as a person of color, not knowing when you will see on the news the next person whose life has been taken. And it takes you back, not just through that one loss, but through every loss that you've experienced. And for many, all the way back to before Trayvon Martin. In Ferguson, what we did was faith communities also worked, but we worked along with the mental health, minority mental health professionals to bring mental health into the communities. There were days we just set up tents and we allowed people to come in the community. We would have health professionals there. People could just stop by and talk about what they were going through. We also provided some opportunities for luncheons where we paid for parents, particularly mothers who had lost children to violence or to state-sanctioned violence, to come together, where we brought professionals from counseling, spiritual care, together so that they would have a community to build relationships. We sent counselors into the school systems. And so it was a lot of work, and it's intense, but it was also done very closely with the faith community. I do believe that the faith community can help get information out. You mentioned programs that I was not aware of, and I believe that many of our constituents are not aware. It is a wonderful opportunity to partner, but understanding that many people live in toxic stress. Some of those children in Ferguson, particularly because of what happened with the militarized policing, have been traumatized to the point where they cannot tolerate loud sounds anymore because of the tear gas bombs that would be set off because of the loud noises. So we don't know what causes trauma for young people and children. What we do know is that it is often expressed in ways that we do not understand. Sometimes children that we think are hyperactive are really suffering from depression. Children who act out in classrooms, we learned, are very often suffering from depression. And so it is imperative that we have health professionals who understand the difference between depression in an adult and depression in our children. We also worked very hard in St. Louis to move police officers out of schools, resource officers, and to move in more counselors who could begin to work with students and to teach them de-escalation, to move from retributive justice practices to restorative justice practices. And I think that's also very essential as we look at things that we can do. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Madam Chair and Committee, that will conclude our presentation. And I would just give a heartfelt ask. A couple of things that I will never know. I will never know what it feels like as a mother to send my son off to school or to work without worrying. I won't know what it feels like to know that my brothers and nephews are not home, whether they're here or whether they're some other part of the country. Would like to know that, but that's one of those things that Pastor Anderson was talking about, the mental and emotional stress, and it has a direct effect on the physical body. So if you've not been familiarized with some of the trauma and the day-to-day stress of just being Black in America or being Latin in America or being Indigenous in America, anyone who is a person of color, if you're not familiar with that, please listen to our heart. Please listen to our heart. It's hurting, and I would hope that, although this is a resolution, I would hope that it would serve as a blueprint in terms of moving forward, especially when it comes to caring for those who have lost loved ones during COVID-19. A couple of weeks ago, as my brother died very suddenly, and none of us who those of us who didn't live in Indiana were not able to go. And I remember that day I got up and I put on my church clothes. Nobody would see me, but I was going to be watching his service online. So COVID has taught us a different way of living, and it's also taught us a different way of dying. That on top of what we've already experienced in disparities with healthcare has been compounded. And we may not know the total wreckage, if you will, that has taken place in our communities, but I'm just asking if everyone just please hear our heart and help us, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Spearman. And again, thank you for bringing the resolution. Thank you to the entire team of presenters for making time in their busy days. I know they get pulled in a lot of directions and probably asked to do a lot of work. And, you know, I think part of the point of this is all of us leaning in to take the load. And so I just want to say that I appreciate each and every one of you for being the messengers, and hopefully then we can build the community around you to lift this up and be successful. I think a small step forward that we can make today is to support the resolution. And so I'm prepared to do a work session on the resolution today. And so I'll ask for a motion in just a minute. Before we get there, I want to acknowledge that the resolution is important. It's meaningful work. It's a statement, and it's a statement that we need to make. I want to thank Ms. George for connecting the work to SB 302 and to SB 341. And I want to acknowledge that we are attempting to do this work in an imperfect world. And I probably am not saying anything that is a surprise to anybody else. And then we're trying to do this work in an imperfect system in an imperfect world, which is a legislative session that lasts for 120 days every other year. And so we have the reality of trying to kick out good policy that will actually make a difference in a session that doesn't generally offer the kind of time that we were able to dedicate today. So I would just ask that the next step is the hard work of making sure, I will speak for the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. We kicked SB 341 out of here without having a whole lot of time to really dig into the financial implications. Both of those bills are going to go over to the Finance Committee. The pace in the Finance Committee is significantly different than the pace in this committee. And we'll need put all hands on deck to make sure that the language in the bills does what we actually want to do so that it actually makes a difference down the road. So that's my call to action. I think what this committee can do today is to stand by this statement and pass it out, say that we've identified the right problem, and we think that globally what's in this resolution is correct. And then I think we all need to work together to make sure that that very technical process of getting bill language to actually accomplish what we want to accomplish is the next step. So that's what I would say. With that, I think I have a motion from Senator Hardy to do pass SCR 5, a second from Senator Harris.
Chair Ratty, can I jump in and just confirm that the motion is to adopt SCR 5?
Thank you. I forgot it was a resolution. So the motion, yes, indeed, is to adopt SCR 5 with a second from Senator Harris. Any other discussion from the members? All right. Seeing none, Secretary, would you, with hope and optimism, let's call the roll.
Senator Hardy?
Yes.
Senator Harris?
Yes.
Senator Kekeffer?
Yes.
Senator Spearman?
Yes.
Chair Ratty?
Yes. All right. Motion passed. Motion passes. All right. Again, with gratitude to everybody who joined us on that bill, we're going to go ahead and move on to Assembly Bill 35. And we are going to invite Ms. Schmidt to the virtual dais to take us through the bill.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Raddy and members of the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services. My name is Dina Schmidt, and I serve as the Administrator for Aging and Disability Services Division, and I will be co-presenting today with Jeff Duncan, our Unit Chief. We'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present AB 35. This bill revises provisions governing certain programs that assist senior citizens and persons with disabilities with costs relating to healthcare. In opening, the intent of the bill really is to remove the restrictive language that's currently in the statute and allow us to adopt policies and regulations to meet the community needs. And to support the agency in utilizing the fundings to meet the needs of the community without any additional fiscal impact. Current funding will be utilized to operate the current program. And this bill also provides some cleanup language throughout the chapter. And our goal is to consolidate the senior prescription drug program with the disability prescription drug program and remove the lengthy income and eligibility requirements and allow those new requirements to be adopted through the regulatory process. We are also looking to align the definitions of seniors and persons with disabilities. As you'll see throughout AB 35, we are proposing to update the statute with the goal of having the ability to serve a little broader scope of individuals beyond those who are just Medicare eligible. And I'll now turn the presentation over to Jeff Duncan, who will walk you through the details and the specific highlights of the bill.
Thank you, Ms. Schmidt. For the record, my name is Jeff Duncan, Unit Chief with the Nevada Aging and Disability Services Division. I would now be happy to walk the committee through each section of the bill and briefly highlight the proposed changes. So starting with Section 1, language has been added to define a person with a disability, which aligns with definition NRS 427A and many other Aging and Disability Services Division programs. Section 2 of this bill is cleanup language to add senior citizens and a newly defined person with disability from Section 1. I'd like to note that sections 2 through 5, 7 through 11, and 14 include language to consolidate the Senior RX program and Disability RX program. In short, both programs receive allocations from the Fund for Health in Nevada, make up a single budget account, and are currently operated as a single program. Then moving on to sections 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9 through 11 of this bill proposed minor cleanup language to ensure services may be provided to senior citizens and persons with a disability. In addition, Section 4 also strikes repetitive language included in other sections of the bill that does not impact the services detailed about the bill. Section 6, the bill proposes to amend the definition of a senior citizen who is 60 years and older. This definitional change of a senior citizen will align with Chapter 427A, the Independent Living Grant Program under Chapter 429, and the Older American Act programs, which are all administered by the Nevada Aging and Disability Services Division. In addition, this section proposes to remove the specific income and eligibility requirements that currently govern the senior prescription program and disability prescription program. There has been many changes to Medicare since the inception of these programs, and this change will allow the agency to adapt the program based on need through regulation. Typically, this bill will now require a senior citizen or a person with a disability who wishes to receive assistance under the consolidated program to be a resident of this state and meet the requirements prescribed by regulation under the Department of Health and Human Services. Section 8 removes language stating that a senior citizen is entitled to an annual grant underneath the program, and provides clarifying language that a senior citizen or a person with a disability may receive. In addition, this section revises language relating to waiver eligibility requirements. Section 12 of the bill authorizes information contained in an application for the program be shared only for purposes relating to administration of programs of the department. The last section, Section 13, provides clarity language on age criteria for services under NRS 612.6 607 for these services, which is 62. Closing, we'd like to thank the committee and open for any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Members, are there any questions on the bill? Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is there a cap then on the age or the income? Because it looks like we cut that out on eligibility for the program as we merge the two.
Tina Schmidt for the record. So we will still have an age cap. We're aligning that with all of our other programs that were in our definition of senior citizens. The income cap will come out of statute, and we will use the regulatory process to adopt a new income standard based on community input and community need. As Mr. Duncan mentioned, the Medicare Part D program has completely changed the intent of this program. This program was developed in statute way before Medicare Part D existed. And so a lot of our Medicare recipients have a completely different need now. And so what we would like to do is have the ability to build a program that actually wraps around current Medicare benefits and provides a better benefit than what we're able to do with these limitations.
So will that help people with their donut hole? Is that your intent?
Tina Schmidt for the record, exactly. Right now, the donut hole has been removed, and so their co-payments are the same throughout the process. But oftentimes one of the barriers is that co-payment, and our program today doesn't cover the co-payment necessarily throughout the process. So we would like to have the ability to adopt regulations and have some to wrap around the Medicare plans that exist today.
So your section 13 that in one place it's 62 and then 60 now, and another place it's going to be 62 still?
So this is Jeff Duncan for the record. That is correct. Section 13 is not operated by our agency, but they wanted to make sure that the proposed bill called out that 62 and over language for that specific NRS.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the question, Senator Hardy. Other members of the committee? All right. Seeing none, let's go ahead and open up the public testimony on AB 35. Those who'd like to testify in support of AB 35.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to testify in support of AB 35, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Will the caller with the last 3 digits of 074 please state and spell your name for the record? You may begin.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, for the record, my name is Charlie Shepard, CharlieShepard, and I am the state president of AARP Nevada. Nevada's older adults and persons with disabilities want to remain living at home where they want to be. The Fund for a Healthy Nevada provides a variety of services that help them maintain their independence and stay healthy. This bill, AB 35, removes current restrictions and will allow the programs to meet the needs of the community. AARP Nevada, on behalf of our 345,000 members across the Silver State, support AB 35 and urge the committee to pass it to increase the number of people who can receive the services they need to stay healthy and independent. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no additional callers wishing to give testimony in support.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and open the lines for testimony in opposition to AB 35.
Callers, if you'd like to give testimony in opposition to Assembly Bill 35, please press *9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers wishing to give testimony in opposition.
All right, then I will go to testimony in neutral.
Callers, if you'd like to give a neutral testimony on AB 35, please press star 9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, there are no callers wishing to give a neutral testimony.
Great, thank you, BPS, once again for your support. We'll bring it back to the committee, and I think Senator Spearman has a question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question would be in line with what Pastor Anderson said in the bill just before this, partnering with faith-based organizations to make sure you get the word out. Is there a strategy to make sure that this is broad and wide so that people know about the changes and actually participate in them?
So Gina Schmidt for the record. Thank you for the question. So a couple things. Historically, this program has been limited in its funding, and so we haven't done a lot of outreach. That's been one of our challenges. However, internally, we are working really hard to figure out ways to partner and coordinate across all of our programs as we do outreach. And additionally, the new regulations, as we adopt them, we will do through the regulatory process, which is a public process, but we will absolutely ensure that we're reaching out to faith-based organizations to ensure participation in that process and making sure that folks are aware. One of the concerns, as you know, seniors and people with disabilities still have a prescription drug need, and they still have high costs related to those prescription drugs. And so it's our goal is to be able to adopt regulations to meet those needs, those new needs. They're different than what they used to be. It used to be prior to Medicare Part D, the cost of prescription drugs was just astronomical, but then Part D came, and then it was copays, and then it was the donut hole. And so it's changed over time. So yes, we intend to do a lot of community outreach. We will partner with Tina Dortch and the Office of Minority Health and Equity to make sure that we are hearing from everybody, all communities, and building a program that actually meets those needs.
And I have the contact information for Pastor Anderson to do a direct outreach to faith communities if you'd like to have it.
Ina Schmidt for the record, absolutely happy to do that.
Okay. Any additional questions? Any final comments from the presenters?
Chair Reddy, thank you. Not at this time. I think we've covered it, and we just appreciate the opportunity to present to you today and for your consideration of this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt, for bringing the bill. We have lost Senator Kiekeffer, so we're going to have to slow down the work session train, and we'll put this on for a future date to see how the committee feels about it. But we appreciate your being here today, so we'll close the hearing on AB 35 and bring it back to the committee. So committee members, in terms of planning ahead a little bit, we are going to take a little bit of a break to create some more space for other committees, as well as anticipating that we will have some longer floor sessions in our near future. So this committee will not convene again until April 22nd. So you can open up that space on your calendars and plan on, and for you as well as the public who may be watching, that the Senate Health and Human Services Committee won't meet again until April 22nd. With that, we'll go ahead and open up public comment.
Thank you, Chair. Callers, if you would like to give public comment, please press star 9 now to enter the queue. Chair Ratty, at this time, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers wishing to give public comment.
All right, once again, thanks to our LCB staff, our Senate staff, the BPS staff for all of the support that you give to us to make these meetings successful. We are adjourned.